One thing Boston radio lacks. There's one thing lacking in Boston radio. And we'll rap about that on this episode of the Boston Robb Show. Welcome back. I am Robb, trying to do God's work since, well, apparently she's too busy to deal directly with humans anymore. Hopefully she'll send a representative again soon. We could use it. So when I was 22, my father killed himself. I was in California, struggling, but working on a top-rated morning show, The Mikey Show on KIOZ in San Diego. And after his death, I had to return to Mass for his funeral, and I stayed a couple of weeks. Tried to help out my mother, my 15 and 17-year-old brothers. The radio show gave me that time off. No threat of losing my job. It wasn't an attack on my manhood. And even though I was part-time, minimum wage, no healthcare, definitely no bereavement time earned, they helped me. They gave me the time and supported me during that time. That job gave me roots and, in a sense, family. And our listeners felt that. You could see it in the ratings. They could tell that our show was genuine and bonded. But even being on a top-rated morning show didn't make everything all good. My personal life was a wreck. The apartment I was living in SoCal was being sold. And the owner was kind enough to call and let me know, hey, if you don't come back out to SoCal, your stuff will be on the street. So when I returned to California, I loaded my stuff in my car, and my car became my new home. I still went to work and thankfully, for the kindness of others, had a place to shower when needed. But I was homeless, living in my car, and working on a #1 rated show in San Diego. That situation may sound awful to some, but that situation paled in comparison to how I felt inside. I was devastated. It was pure devastation. At times, wondering if I should follow in my father's footsteps. The grief and guilt I felt for my brothers who were now forced out of the home they had grown up in by their dad's brothers. And the dad's brothers didn't so much force them out as they were the messengers. They were just letting me and my brothers know, you can't stay in that house anymore. Your dad's girlfriend's taking it, and you guys got to get out. One brother was going into his senior year of high school. The other, my dad was supposed to be bringing him to his first year of college. I also spent time contemplating how's my mother going to find the strength to overcome and continue on. But only a few years later, she died. Now, during this time, I had put everything I had into the show I was on. Thank God for radio. Saved my life. And because I was homeless, I slept at the station at times. And the people who made up that station supported me. They showed me kindness, looking for nothing in return. It was just genuine compassion. And when the kindness of others, like finding a place to rent, sleeping in a radio station because you have nowhere to go, when the kindness of others comes to play such a vital role in your life, as it did mine, you'll earn a deep respect for that virtue. I am still to this day humbled by people's kindness during that time in my life. Talk about respect and so-called being a man. You want to earn that from someone? You want to make a lasting impact on someone? Be kind when they're at their worst. They will respect you till the end of time. Threaten humans at their worst, see if they respect you. Twitter recommended a tweet, which has since been deleted. I screenshotted it and reposted it with a thread if you want to check my Twitter. I'll read it to you in a few. But the tweet identified an important issue I personally experienced here in Boston, and one that's vital for our community and the radio industry. There's a big aspect of radio that requires a degree of social responsibility. And Boston radio lacks one thing. Truly one thing. But not every station lacks it. Not every show. It's mostly the white rich guys who host the shows that seem to be lacking this trait. And you can tell how spoiled or rotten some people are by their disregard and disrespect for this one thing. I'll get to the thing lacking in a minute, and I will read you the tweet that I had to screenshot because it was getting deleted. I don't know why it got deleted. It was a good, thought-filled tweet. But I want to be straightforward. This podcast isn't veiled. It's not passive-aggressive insider talk. This is also not a critique on anyone personally. This is on how things are being handled professionally. Though some professionals try to make it personal, I am not. This is about actions in a workplace. A public workplace. A very public workplace. Publicly judged, publicly rated, and supposedly a public service. That's why radio has to run public service announcements. I'm speaking up because I care about radio and my city of Boston. I'm speaking up because so many radio people have said these things to me but are afraid to voice their opinion because they feel like their hope for a career, to getting further, to being on the air, is tied to the Boston radio veteran Greg Hill, Kim Jong-Hill, and his show. Though his record would prove otherwise, he really hasn't had any people go from his show and carry on to do great things or great shows or maybe a great trash company. I don't know. I never used them. That's one guy from his show has another business. But no one has been highly promoted in radio. So I don't know why they think this. If you're not from around here, Greg is an alt-right winger. He's been under the radar doing a radio morning show for 30 years in Boston. And he's a rural folk. He's lived his whole life in the same town. But unlike most rural folk, he's never had financial insecurities. And the producers of his show were forced last year to get the Intercom CEO, David Field, their boss's boss, forced to get his attention and reprimand him because of his reckless behavior. I'll say, if Dave is listening, I'd love to help. If Dave Field cares for the city of Boston and the radio station it serves, I'm here. Friends have told me my problem in radio is I don't play the radio politics game. But to me, it's not a game, and it isn't when people's lives are at risk, where people's lives become put at jeopardy, their livelihood, their career. When people get oppressive and abusive, what's the use of being a yes man? And I'll get to the COVID risks Greg forced his team to go through in a minute, but I witnessed stuff firsthand too. The former AAF PD program director, the boss of the old rock station that is no longer here, got burnt to the ground. The boss, Ron Valeri, held a meeting with Hillman's show in 2017, right before I left. Or they didn't want me there anymore. You could tell why. I'm definitely not a yes man. But he had a closed-door meeting after I'd been hounding him for 6 months to find out the ratings. They were horrible. And our bonuses are tied to the ratings if you got it in your contract. Which, by the way, people on the show had let me know that when I helped them reach number 1 in 2015, that was the first time in their career they had hit a bonus. That says something, too. But in this meeting, the boss, Ron, said, Greg, you're coming off way too racist on the air. And Ron, at that time, was also deleting the show's audio and podcasts off the Intercom site due to the blatant racism. And my guys who were putting those podcasts up were confused. They weren't sure how the audio kept getting taken down. They tried to repost it and say, hey, where are those bits that we're supposed to have up? They said, I don't know. But this is how things were handled. And this is how Greg likes it. All in secret. Everything behind somebody's back. And so finally, I found out, Ron just never came to us and said, don't post the spazzing out audio. Don't post that bit. It's extremely racist. I knew it was. But again, I don't get to choose what goes on the air. I didn't do that bit. And I thought it was weird how they would let it go on air, but then wanted no trace of it afterwards. Weird, huh? Real bad communication at this radio station. And it was even worse how the people constantly acted behind others' backs. But again, this is the type of leadership, the type of atmosphere created. And none of this is like Howard Stern style radio, by the way. If you've never heard it, if you don't listen to it, this is not Howard Stern radio. Howard is clever. There's nothing clever about this. Now, before I read this tweet and talk more about the state of radio in Boston, it's important to know what the Massachusetts state motto is. Do you know? Maybe you're from here. Maybe you're from here and you've never known the Mass state motto. It's, what do you think, you're better than me? What, do you think you're better than us? And then some fighting words after, usually improv from town to town. Our state animal is the Fighting Irish mascot, or maybe that's just our spirit animal. No, spirit animal has to be the Adidas shell toe. And almost everyone here in Mass is a hardo. For those who are not a townie, which just means you're not local, it just means you're a tough guy. Hardo, tough guy. I think what I just said too is Casey Affleck's biography on IMDb. You'll have to check. So what does the radio industry in Boston lack? Compassion. When you lack genuine compassion, you lack being genuine. It's hard to be a tough guy all the time. Contrary to popular belief, not everyone in Boston is related to Mark Wahlberg. Though I would say here in Mass, the little angel and devil on our shoulders are each a tiny little version of Mark Wahlberg. Tiny little tough guy angels and devils. But on Boston radio, it's a bunch of tough guy hardos. It's reminiscent of the incels. I did a podcast on incels. If you don't know, incel stands for involuntary celibate. I believe they're responsible for a few mass shootings. Their mindset, me against the world. They got a real problem with women. They think women don't appreciate a guy's mind. They only want money and a hot bod. What they call a chad. But in reality, most of these guys are smug, passive-aggressive personalities who think money is the way to a woman's heart. And these guys will usually love telling you what famous people they know. Famous by association. Well, let's get into the tweet. Here's the tweet that Twitter recommended to me. And I'm going to say, Twitter, great job recommending this one. It's from Jerry Thornton 1, verified on Twitter, former WEEI radio personality, author, talented writer. This dude is super talented. I felt really grateful that when I worked at AAF, he was at EEI. I got to see him in the hallways. We'd stop him, ask him to come into the office and talk with us about stuff. Just a fascinating, smart dude. So he wrote this tweet just a week ago or so. Mid-June, this tweet comes out. And I thought it was very thoughtful. It was a 2-tweet thread. And I don't think he said anything wrong. I don't know why he deleted it. And again, Jerry, I mean no disrespect by screenshotting this, retweeting it, and now podcasting about it. This is an important issue. That's why you tweeted about it. And no one will speak up. Maybe he wants to have a job at EEI. I'm okay never working for Entercom again. I understand that. I have the Boston Robb Show. I'm fine if Entercom never wants to hire me. Although, I don't see what's wrong with this. I'm not going to play the game and kiss Greg's ass. I'm not. Like I told the people that I hired, that I respect in radio, that some of them are still there. He didn't make me, and he ain't going to break me. I don't have to look back and think I spent 5, 10, however many years kissing that guy's ass to end up going and starting a trash company. And I'm grateful for that. I'm grateful for being able to say what I think and not have to bend over backwards for a dude who treats you like rubbish. Just show me somebody who hangs out with this guy out of work that's over the age of 20. Show me. And that isn't forced to go to charity events. Show me. I'm waiting. Here's Jerry Thornton 1's tweet. I've heard from inside WEEI that the situation there has deteriorated worse than we've imagined. Who imagined, Jerry? Must have never worked for Greg. No direction, no leadership, demoralized staff. The morning show was number 2. I questioned that when it started. And then now it's number 7 and still dropping. The .com barely gets any traffic. Then there's another tweet, which I think was just a little more personal, how he, helped build EEI or whatever. People thought that was arrogant, but I say, no, I think he just means like he put everything he had to that station. Whether the ratings were great or not, like he genuinely had a passion for what he was doing. Not saying he made it the best thing. It's been here before a lot of these people, and it will be, I don't think it will be here after, but we'll see. And to that tweet, I say, Jerry, worse than who imagined? Not worse than the wicked talented woman who during a worldwide pandemic walked away from her career, a paycheck, health insurance. Not worse than she imagined. He just had his co-host, Greg Hill just had his co-host quit in the middle of a pandemic. They were like, what do you got lined up? Nothing. I just can't take this anymore. Not worse than She Imagined. Not worse than the guy who quit radio to start a trash truck business imagined. And then that guy came back to be on the air for free. Working the same old bits he did before, just now not getting paid to do it. He would come in when I was there at AAF, just to do it for free. And he would always say, no other show will hire me. And most of these people aren't willing to move from Boston. Why would you? Love the city. So thus they feel tied to this one dude who holds the key to radio for them. Well, he's got to retire at some time. And if he's not going to burn down all these stations, we'll see what happens. I don't think he's handing the keys to anyone. Not without a fight. Oh, speaking of that, remember the movie Fight Club? Great flick. I can't wait for the remake. Now, imagine if there was a Fight Club, but none of these guys had ever been punched in the face. You know, the people that run their mouth like they've never been in a fight, they run it often and quite far past the line, sometimes to women they've never even met. And while some of these guys that are on the air have trust funds, some of the other guys, these hosts like Greg, their families owned racehorses. It's funny how they'll never tell you that part of the story when they talk about their business successes. They never mention that. And I know rich people who know even richer people who know people who own racehorses. When I lived in San Diego, we weren't far from Del Mar. And that kind of money is generational wealth money. So it's funny to me. Racehorse money never came up for Greg Hill. Except, you know how I even know about this? We had a psychic in the studio, Matt something. I'm blanking on his name. Great psychic. He got a TV show, I believe. And one day in the studio, he's saying, I'm getting racehorses. And it's just Greg, me, the rest of the show in the studio. And everyone's looking at each other like puzzled. But you see the color coming out of Greg's face. And Greg's like, oh, well, my grandparents owned racehorses. And people who had worked with him for decades were like, you've never said that. What? Your grandparents owned racehorses? The only way it came up with was a psychic, which if that doesn't lend to the credibility of the psychic, I don't know what does, because he was trying to keep that top effing secret. So instead of this being a fight club, it's more like an entitlement club. Like if Ed Norton's character was just a rich kid who went around acting the way he did in Fight Club, but never actually went to the basement to fight anyone. That may make maybe a decent movie. Fright Club. And I say this for the fans of the brand EEI. They get the stickers, the shirts, the hats, they listen to the socks there, they love to whatever with EEI. Some people love the brand. It was like AAF, it was the rock station of Boston. You'll love the brand. Well, just like AAF, this Hillman show is burning EEI to the ground. It's the radio equivalent to flipping the Monopoly board over when you're losing. I'm calling it EEI will be gone. There's two ways for radio shows to stay on the air: ratings or revenue. And a morning show sets a tone for a station. A successful in the ratings morning show can help the whole station, can make everyone profitable. But if ratings aren't your thing, that station's going to suffer. If your show is just built around my business connections, and that's how my show stays funded, and you don't care about the ratings, and your show is selfishly passive, aggressive, inside jokes that not a lot of people can understand, and that's what you're doing on the air, the rest of the show might have trouble making money, getting ratings. I mean, it's just, I don't know. I did radio for a long time. This is, stuff you can break down and see coming quite clearly. That's why I say WEI will be gone. So I recently came across a podcast on YouTube. The audio is still up there. And this podcast talks about what happened when Greg came into contact with COVID and then went into work. In fact, they play audio from the morning show on WEEI. And this audio, this quote-unquote bit, it's not really a bit, though. It's just kind of a mantrum. It's a grown-ass man having a tantrum that people were concerned about their health. Mind you, during a worldwide pandemic where most people are trying to do their best to keep from exposing others, this one isn't. And this is on the sports station in Boston, on the morning show. And this podcast is playing the audio of it that, I don't know, goes on for way too long. If you're going to talk about COVID and getting quarantined, make it into a bit. Something lighthearted, something funny. Not passive, aggressive anger. Not you having a mantram that people were looking out for their own health and upset that you didn't care for anyone on your team. So for Greg, being a guy with a 30-year tenure at a radio station and being a wealthy dude, you'd think a COVID contact would be no big deal. He's probably got sick time, vacation time. He's not worried about paychecks. He's not like the kid at Stop and Shop or even his producers who gotta pay bills, pay rent, keep the electric on. They might not have sick time. They might not even have health care working at this company. They might be part-time. They might, be doing this in fear every day that like, oh my gosh, I'm working in a closed space in a studio that's tight to other people who talk into a microphone. And I hope, I don't get this, but I have to come in. I have to get this paycheck. That's a reality for some people, even if they love what they're doing. Greg's not in that situation. He could easily, as the host, if you're a producer, yeah, you got to be in the studio. You got to work the board. You got to do different things. As the host and a rich guy who's got time off, you could say, listen, I came into contact with somebody who had COVID. I got to get tested, wait for those results. I'll do the show from home. We can set it up. Radio is such a great industry. And I know people in this industry who, during the pandemic, broadcasted from home. It was no big deal. It was no threat to their manhood. But for Greg, that's not the situation. For the insecure, it's just not this easy. So instead of getting tested and staying home, Greg came into work and put everyone at risk, letting them know, I believe, when he showed up. Like, oh, I had a COVID contact. I don't know if he got tested. It's hard for me to listen to some of these podcasts. It just seems like cruel. Maybe if that's the kind of radio you're into, cruel radio. So he came into work, regardless of the situation I just told you about, where he could have stayed home. And I think the employer at that point, his boss, would have been so understanding of like taking a couple days just to make sure your team is safe. But no, he put everyone at danger. Why? For no other reason than he lacks compassion. That's an awful leader. No regard for others. Or no regard for others that he doesn't see as powerful as he perceives himself to be. The producers had to write and sign a letter sending it to the CEO of the company, their boss's boss, David Field, which resulted in Greg being forced. They had to force this dude, a 30-year vet, supposedly the leader of the ship. They had to force him to quarantine himself and work from home. In a worldwide pandemic, when most people are doing their best to look out for others, you have the few who just want to put everyone in danger because they're in danger. Again, this is not personal, but what do you call that? I'd say it's a coward. It's not leading. Well, unless your lead by example is just endanger everyone. You know what? If I'm not going to be here, everyone should maybe not be here. Again, this is why I say EEI is going to be gone. At least that team, Hillman Show's team, got some leadership from the CEO, who had to teach and scold the longest running radio person in the building that putting people's lives at risk, not good. At a time where so many, my wife is a frontline COVID nurse, so many people are just looking out for others. And there's this guy, forcing people less paid, way less pampered, forcing their exposure to a deadly virus. This is a 30-year radio vet, a grown-ass man. And then he had a tantrum on the air because his producers didn't want to risk their lives for a boss and a company who probably doesn't even give them healthcare. Like Real Housewife Radio. This guy spent time on air being upset. I'm sure you can find it somewhere. It's on YouTube. There's podcasts about this. You can listen to it. How he's mad that he's broadcasting from home. Really? You don't have to drive into work. You get the luxury of your house. You can have snacks and drinks or whatever right there. I'm sure if he had a glass of wine, he would have thrown it in his producers' faces. I mean, really, this would make great TV on like E! Channel. Some kind of drama. Real Housewives of Radio. And when I say they probably don't have healthcare, it's because when I was hiring people at this company, instead of being able to hire a few full-time talented humans, they would not allow anyone I hired to go over a certain amount of hours. That kept them from having to pay for their health insurance. That kept them part-time. So if you wonder why people have to work 2 jobs, sometimes one job is just for healthcare. Now imagine this situation happens and that's your boss. The guy who wants to sink the ship because he's drowning. He's not even on the ship. You're trying to throw him a life vest. He's out in the water, but he's like, no, sink the whole ship. Stick a hole in it. Drown that ship. Imagine if this was the Titanic movie and the ending was Leo. Instead of letting Rose have the door, he pulled her off into the water and they both froze. That's this guy. When I heard this podcast and these guys talking about it, I thought, God, that's the most cowardice thing I've heard in a long while. I wonder if the 20-year-olds that he's trying to impress were impressed by this disregard for others. You know, the 20-year-olds who were still out at spring break during the pandemic. We're gonna live forever. Those cats. I wonder if they were impressed. I don't know. He could look up the ratings. He could see if there were 20-year-olds like, oh, what a cool dude endangering everyone. Funny, man. Well, it's really not funny. In fact, would you listen to that? Him being upset on air because his employees cared about their health? Wicked lack of compassion. Just being a coward. If I get COVID, everyone's getting COVID. Kind of sounds like a spoiled brat, huh? Good leader? Is that a nice boss? Who would want to work for a coward? A coward that puts your life at risk. For an 8th place radio show, mind you. And Greg is the guy who rails against universal healthcare, but has his charity events to raise money for people whose healthcare wouldn't cover costs. It's all self-serving aggrandizement. If Greg supported universal healthcare, who would pat him on the back for covering people's healthcare costs? I pointed that out on the air too. He would have these people in and say, can you believe that healthcare won't cover the cost for this? I say, yeah, I believe it, because when he's off the air, you're talking about how we shouldn't have universal healthcare. Things shouldn't be covered. But how would he balance out his karma if he didn't have this charity? Now, if you listen to the show or the podcast, you might hear Greg specifically mention the word leadership in a sarcastic way to one of these interim WEEI station bosses, which this boss is a kid, by the way. I don't even believe he's been doing radio as long as Greg. Greg may have been doing radio longer than this kid's alive, but Greg takes a lot of pride in his 30 plus years of being on the radio, and he'll bring it up as a defense when he needs to. But Greg will sarcastically ask this kid if he plans on having some leadership, which is a great inside passive-aggressive joke, by the way. What audience are you reaching with that joke? The audience that read the deleted tweet? So me? Rad to know you're programming specifically for me, one person. It definitely reflects in the station's ratings. But it becomes odd how accepting Greg is when he says it's a bad example for me to be late to work. Here's another on-air bit they did. Greg was late to work and saying it's bad leadership, but he won't accept responsibility for the show's ratings, atmosphere. Maybe because that's more of a personal reflection on who he is. But this taking ownership of being late to work bit continues on air on a Boston radio station for maybe 7 minutes. It continues on so long because while he's taking ownership for being late one day, he's trying to get his producers to verify that this is the only time he's ever been late. Listen, when I was his producer, he was late a handful, maybe a fortnight. I don't know. A lot of times. I didn't care. I didn't think that mattered. What mattered more to me was that he was the first one to leave when the show ended. He just disappeared. And there were production guys and bosses and people that wanted to talk to him. I mean, he had a radio show. Why would you disappear? But he was notorious for being gone. In fact, they put that on me. Like, I had to watch him babysit this dude. Like, don't let him leave. What do you mean? Well, he's got commercials he has to record. And I got to be in charge of him not leave. I mean, he's getting paid for it, right? Just tell the businesses he doesn't want to do it. Again, kind of a brat. Bratty leadership. This is my TED Talk. Spoiled brat leaderships. But this bit on being late would continue because everything's threatening to him. So I wonder, is that entertaining? I guess when you hear that a Boston sports station is in 8th place, it makes sense. Last year, the station I was 19th. I don't know. The podcast I listened to went through all of this. And I can't even name 19 stations in Boston. So you got to be pretty unlikable as a personality to make folks not want to hear about their sports teams in Boston. And by the way, this is also the show that had Tom Brady interviews. Tom Brady would call into this show. And ratings for radio are publicly available. You can look up any station's numbers if you want. You can also see their cum, how many listeners they get. In Boston, you'd imagine the station that had Tom Brady on is getting the most ever in the history of radio, right? Wrong. Is that irony? A guy who desperately is trying to relive his high school days as one of the cool kids has a publicly judged radio show that just isn't popular? Even with the most popular athlete ever in the history of Boston sports? Is that ironic? You have to be a repellent personality, or maybe just cruel on the air, to not kill it in Boston with Tom Brady. Imagine spending 30 plus years and having no insight, no leadership skills, no impactful communication. Or maybe you're keenly aware of it and continue to choose to be passive-aggressively putting blame on others. The one guy in the building who brags about his 30-year tenure. Brags about, I was only late once, even though they pointed out, well, it was more like 3 times. But yeah, late once, if that's what you want to say. That's what he brags about. And the people who work for him and around him quit with nothing lined up because the environment is so bad. Sorry, one guy had something lined up. He went into junk removal. He quit radio to go take junk out of houses. What does that tell you? Forget the ratings. How's that for a public image? People would give up their health care in a worldwide pandemic to be free from that atmosphere. A friend said to me a long while ago, why do you listen to DMX, a guy who would probably beat you up? But I always loved the radical way X spoke to God in his music and on his albums. Plus, my probation officer at the time loved DMX, so it gave us something to rap about. That same thought crosses my mind when I saw that tweet about Boston radio. Why would you listen to a passive-aggressive one-upper, a tough guy who gossips, guys that if you knew them, they'd treat you like rubbish, people who exert their power just to feel better about themselves? And this attitude sets a tone. Just like a fighter picking a song to walk out to, they're setting a tone. These shows set a tone with the audience and eventually the community. The tone this show sets? Mocking people for a personal day. You're not a man, you're not a success if you're ever tardy. Show emotion or compassion, you're weak. Spend time with your family, you're soft and you'll never be a success. If you like your wife, you're a loser. These guys are trying so hard to be like a vintage 1950s how to be a man reel. Like something the government made in the 50s to tell you how to be an American man. Surprised all the commercials aren't ED, divorce lawyers, and strip clubs. But we know if it's not ratings, it's revenue. And all Greg's suburban business buddies help fund this show. Greg thinks he appeals to 21-year-olds. You can look it up in the ratings. He really appeals to like-minded 60-year-olds who want to relive their high school years. The only thing appeals to the kids he's trying to impress and get the attention of is the money, the people they hang out with. You want to impress a kid? Tell him you know the sports star he watches on TV. Kids get excited for Disney because they want to see Mickey. But what a repellent of a personality you have to be to have Tom Brady on your show in Boston and not still be number one. There was one legit tough guy on the air on his show in AAF back in those days. And by legit, I mean a guy who was paid to fight. Legendary hockey enforcer, LB. Who, by the way, was one of the kindest, nicest, most compassionate humans I've ever known. And outside a bit of radio gold ribbing, this man was genuinely lovable. A trait lacking in the local industry. And being lovable is unheard of on EEI. I'm sure if you said, like, you guys are not lovable, they'd take that as a compliment. Funny how these guys don't take note from an actual tough guy. These hosts act like they're entering prison every day, where if you show any weakness, you'll be beaten. And I know the producers on these shows feel like that, like what happened to them during COVID. And this environment is odd for a radio host, not by me, by the way, but who's been labeled by others in the industry as a jock sniffer, who just wants the fame of athletes, wants to be around that, seen as one of them. I'll look at the Twitter feed of Greg. I don't know the handle, but go check it out. He's pinned a video. I wouldn't pin this video. It's cool. I wouldn't pin it. But it shows a video of a 60-something-year-old at a bar with a 20-something-year-old athlete bouncing to a Katy Perry song, Firework. Great song, by the way. A look at who I know video. Though if you didn't know who those people were and you just came across it, you might think that's some post-COVID reunited video. Some kid brought their uncle grandpa out to the bar for the night. I guess some guys would think that's cool. I always thought the guys in college who came back to hook up with high school girls were most likely losers in college. Now imagine those guys are grown men with careers, families, and now bar hopping, hoping to hook up with the athlete's sloppy seconds. Pretty impressive. And I gotta address the funds or the charities, because whenever a critique is lobbied at these shows, they at some point, if not immediately, use the charity as a shield. Which is odd because charities don't equal being a good human. Just like being religious doesn't make you a good human. Don't believe me? Go ask a relocated priest. Charity is such a small thing when you compare it to daily having a microphone to speak to large communities across a state, or small communities depending on your ratings. Great, you raise money to help healthcare costs, but then you go on air and consistently rally against healthcare actually covering those costs. And also complaining about being an employer who has to cover those costs. At this point, it's almost dumb for him to not want universal healthcare. It's Good Samaritan fraud. Instead of using humans to benefit your perception of good karma, why don't you join them in their fight to not have to go on the radio, not have to reach out to charities to have their healthcare essentials covered? Why? Maybe because it doesn't serve the only God with a little g you know? You? It's being a fraud. Maybe the hypocrisy is why the ratings suffer. People can smell the disingenuous. And this show reeks. Then there's the old trigger warning. This is a constant favorite bit. I can't listen to the audio of this show often because it's so predictable. The extreme passive-aggressive inside jokes that are tailored to me, though I don't listen. And boringly repetitive, I'm upset, you're upset. Oh, let me guess, you're upset someone's upset? You're offended by someone's offense? Something new has got your panties in a bunch? Or maybe there's a list of words you shouldn't say at a college. For a clique that claims to be so tough, so American, and hate people who take offense or show sensitivity, they sure get triggered a lot. For calling others snowflakes, they seem to be the ones that melt down a lot. It comes across as being terrified of any change. Trump's dog whistle, the quote-unquote good old days, had all these guys' ears perking up. They take offense at people who take offense. Whoever yells the loudest is the most upset. Which, that mindset also shows the level of thought into this. They should just end every sentence with, You will not replace us. The white men who are so concerned what people think about white men, but haven't actually taken some time to listen to themselves and how they act or how they lead. They're the self-proclaimed toughest Americans, yet cower, then react with anger at the thought of pronoun usage, requests of compassion, or historical accuracies like critical race theory. Any of that's brought up. What it's really saying is they're fragile. Their worldview can't handle much change. Ever seen someone studying really hard, like right before an exam, and you try to tell them about a TED Talk and they just shut you down? They're like, my brain's full. Really, their brain's just repeating over and over what they were studying. That's like the similar reaction these guys have to any kind of change. Their brain's full. Now, if G.I. Joe taught us 90s kids anything, it's what? Knowing is half the battle. The other half can only mean taking action. So to be a good leader, you would need to know your flaws, genuinely, not passive-aggressively. Not passive-aggressively shunting off your critics, talking about, well, I have a charity. But then taking action on them. That's in part what's been wild about the past 4 years, the last president. The leadership singing, everything is awesome, constantly. To be a great leader, you gotta actively be working on the flaws. Scary, I know. And if you don't think it's scary, do it. Making veiled, passive-aggressive comments on air instead of actually addressing the critiques, or even worse, lying about how popular you are, may be a reason talented people walk away from that environment with nothing to go to. And it's why people are tweeting about the lack of leadership, because some arrogant brat is pissing away a rad opportunity. Davy Field. Imagine having a morning show in that place where they cared about the community. They just didn't broadcast about wanting to get beer deliveries past 6 o'clock at a Southie beach, which is a real thing they spend time on the air at this Boston sports station. It seems like such an isolated issue, but again, it's a selfish brat doing just whatever he wants. He doesn't care what's entertaining to the community, what's serving the community. Getting beer delivered past 6 o'clock to Southie beaches gets major airtime on a Boston sports morning show. Weird. I don't know. Is that a huge time? I haven't seen it anywhere in the news. Maybe he's the only one covering it. Maybe it's breaking. And it's not just they're going over this topic, but they're having like Boston City Council people on to debate it. I don't know. Is this the new legalized cannabis fight? I must have missed it. But this atmosphere is created and comes from the top. Same with the way things get handled. These people aren't fighting for something, unless it's beer delivery to the beach. They're just fighting against people who are fighting for a cause. That comes across as being terrified of change, which makes sense for a host who spent his whole life in the same town, doing the same thing. It just it reads like a small worldview. And I once said to him on the air, the way he talks is like a guy who spent his entire life living in the same town. But the best part about that line, the best part of that, what I said to him on air, was that I didn't come up with that. Someone said that to me. And that someone had known him for way longer than I had. And they said it to me off to air. I just said it directly to him and on air. No wonder he didn't want to keep me around. I'm not a yes man. And Kim Jong-il needs to be surrounded with people who make him feel safe. Kim Jong-il is a guy who learns about life and others from news, secondhand sources. It's what you expect from people who say they pride themselves on making enemies. In more ways than one, that seems like a premeditated cop-out to why people may not like you. And not just not like you, but believe your shtick is not worth the time to debate. A majority of the time, do you know who says, I make enemies everywhere I go? Assholes. People who know they aren't likable. Take your lumps and do better. Greg always used to compare himself and his show to the Patriots and Brady and Belichick. It was only really an excuse for when he threw his temper tantrums, comparing yelling on a football field to in a radio station. Which is odd because I would always say to him, like, you don't have to yell. Just communicate to me what you need. Or when he was yelling about somebody else, I said, let's go talk to that person. Let's pull him into a room and say, hey, we need to talk to you about this. Never wanted to do it. It was always a point of contention that I would bring that up. But I thought that Patriots comparison was bad because I don't think Brady was always the last to arrive and the first to leave. Plus, Brady was winning stuff. So the one thing Boston radio lacks, compassion, is the one thing I have for fans of WEEI. Thoughts and prayers, WEEI fans. I'm Rob. Thanks for listening to the Boston Rob Show. Hit subscribe, share it with a friend or a boss. You may need to hear some inspirational stuff like this. I want to help. Proof is I worked in that environment. I spoke about for 3 years. I moved my entire family here to take this job. And I was very upfront in my dealings. I spent countless times trying to convince Greg, let's go and talk to these people. Let's communicate. Instead of this passive-aggressive stuff. Let's talk to him like a man. Let's raise issues like a boss. He declined. He's still on air. People are still miserable. But I encourage you, much like I did with Greg, speak up. You have a voice, use it. It maybe is fitting to speak of this kind of tyranny, which it is, on a very small scale. But when somebody has that much power, and they just abuse it, during a worldwide pandemic, they just expose their team, the people that work for them, that have to come in, or he'll fire them, that have to be there to earn their paycheck, and he's just exposing them to a deadly virus because, well, if I get COVID, everyone gets COVID. I don't know what kind of leadership that is. Bratty leadership? Spoiled brat leadership? I really don't know. Seems like a coward. You didn't want to be the only one. You were scared. And you thought, maybe if I expose everyone, we're all in this together. There's another way to get people all in something together. And actually, you're quite good at it. When they want to rally around to overthrow someone. Overthrow somebody that's exerting this tyrannical force upon them. So I encourage people, especially on a weekend like this, 4th of July weekend, declare your independence. Speak up. Use your voice. You have it for a reason. Don't look back and think, wow, I spent how many years dedicating myself to this craft and I got nothing to show. Because why? Well, thoughts and prayers, EEI. I don't think that station's going to be around much longer. I hope I'm wrong. But when the longest running show host over there has the thought process of, if I'm getting COVID, everyone's getting COVID, I can't imagine him feeling selfless enough to hand the keys, the microphone, whatever, over to the next person to take over. I'm sure right around retirement, somewhere in there, EEI will be gone. Hey, good for the other sports station. Good for them. My advice to everybody else at EEI, start getting connections elsewhere in the Boston industry. It might help you at some point, so you don't have to walk away to nothing. I'm Boston Rob. Again, thank you so much for listening. Peace.